Welcome to Bamfordrose, and it's question of the week time. Now in this week's question of the week, we're going to look at a few bolt-on emissions related devices. They're bolt-on to the engine, shouldn't really be on a sports car, they're there only for legislation, that often go wrong. And in garages like this, that are run by petrol heads, for petrol heads, these problems get resolved pleasingly on the wallet. Whereas at garages that aren't run by petrol heads, result in emails like this to me, traffic light status reports that go with these emails saying how particular garages that aren't petrol heads charge for these problems. Now, if you are an owner or enthusiast, then stay tuned. We'll go through each one of these, a quick overview of how it works, and then the petrol head solution on how you solve these problems. If you work for a main agent and you're watching this, pause, click the Patreon link, donate, come back, and then I'll tell you how to do your job. So those letters are obviously from distressed customers that have got their car in at particular garages that are faced with thousands of pounds worth of repair bills for something that's not actually stopping the car from driving. It just triggers a fault code, then maybe puts it into a limp home. Now, viewers of this channel are going to be very familiar with me exposing these types of garages. Now, all of the components that I'm going to go through don't actually need a spanner taking to the car to fix. You just need one of these, a laptop, and someone that knows how to use it. Now, before we can go through these components and say how petrol heads fix them for petrol heads, we need them out of the way. Now, there's no better, more efficient way to get them out of the way than filing them in the correct place to start with. So here we have a secondary air injection system. Now this is removed from this car, and we'll go through how it all fits and works. Got to take the inlet manifold off to get to this component. Then when you get it out, you need to renew it. As you can see, that's probably quite expensive. Is it needed? No. There's no place on a sports car whatsoever. Best place to put this, bingo, in the bin, fixed. Next, tracker module. Now I've seen these been described to customers as immobilizers. So when they go wrong, you've got no choice but to renew it. I think they're about £1,300 plus VAT. Well, when you can just disconnect them from the harness and remap the body module. So rather than buy a new one of these for £1,300, best place to fix it, 2 out of 2 in the bin. Next, this is a V8, this is your EGR valve. These can sometimes stick open and then the car drives extremely lethargically because you've got a huge slug of spent gas from the exhaust manifold going back into the inlet manifold. Not that expensive, but we don't want them destroying the drivability of a sports car. So when they go wrong, even if they don't go wrong, take them off the car and file them in the appropriate place. Next one is on the V12, not the V8. We have the primary catalyst. Now, this manifold looks like it should be on a chassis that's made by Massey Ferguson and not on a sports car. When these primary cats go, if you're in at certain garages, they want to fix this by selling you a new one of these. Now, a new one of these goes for about £5,000. To fit it, probably £2,500. So that's more than double the price of what it takes just to remove the catalyst and put it in the bin, which is the best fix. Now, I'm going to attempt to do this now. This is so heavy. I think it's going to file itself if it goes in that way. Fixed. Now, parts and labour of what we have just thrown in the bin is about 20 grand's worth of work spread over a few cars. Now, if you had to spend 20 grand on your car, you'd be putting an exhaust system on it, high lift cams, big brake kit, Bilstein suspension, and be driving around in a fundamentally different car than what you had in the first place. 20 grand on those components in the bin just gets you the car that you had before repaired, the same. That's why if you must spend big amounts of money, it's better to actually spend it on something tangible that you can feel. So let's get all these components back out. We'll talk about how they work and then how we fix them properly. So that is the secondary air injection system. Here we've got the pump. This is the air inlet to the pump. So air comes in there, gets pumped and gets fed out of that port and pipe work here, which goes to both the actuator valves, which then allow the gas to go down to each cylinder head opening. The system fits in the valley of the V8 engine. So, the purpose of secondary air is so that at cold start, fresh air is injected into the cylinder head port post the exhaust valve. Then a slight excess of fuel at cold start mixes with that fresh air that goes and rests on the face of the catalyst, where the fresh air and the excess of fuel obviously burn and create an exotherm, which makes the catalyst hotter quicker than what it would have been if that fresh air was not injected into the fuel-rich mixture coming out of the combustion chamber. So as emission standards tightened, the cold start emissions got more restrictive. And what that meant is that after cold start on something like an EU3 car, if your catalyst wasn't converting gas, remembering that catalysts don't convert gas until they get up to a certain temperature, normally about 330 degrees, then 20 seconds into that test, if you then started to convert gas, you'd have still passed your sort of cold start and idle phase of that emissions test. But when EU4 emissions came along, you probably needed to get your catalyst lit off and up to the temperature needed to convert gas, probably after about 6, 7, 8 seconds. So if you weren't converting gas that soon after start, then you'd fail your emissions test. So this system was needed for the automaker to meet the homologated spec to sell the car. As owners and users of the car, we don't need this. This is serving us no purpose at all. Now, it only runs after cold start. Probably runs for about 20 seconds after cold start. And sometimes if you listen carefully, you can hear this pump making a whirring sound, because they can sound quite loud when they wear. Now, when you start warm, because you're not trying to get the catalyst hot quicker, then the pump doesn't run. So this only runs at cold start. Now, it's got an extremely small amount of influence on tailpipe emissions. And yes, if you took this away and the car was producing more emissions, and if you extrapolated that emissions addition to the environment over millions of cars, and it probably makes a difference. But of the teeny tiny amount of sports cars that Aston Martin has sold, it makes absolutely no difference to the environment whatsoever if we take away this component. Now, what had happened here, one of the letters that I got from someone that pulled the car out of a dealership, was that they'd picked up that this component had got a fault code to it, and they needed to take the inlet manifold off to investigate. Now, the fault code was for a voltage supply issue to the the pump, not for any running. But they said they heard air leaks from underneath the inlet manifold. And because of that, then the engine was running, I don't know, lean, or that got mentioned in the conversation, and they needed to have a look and see what's going on. So there's a lot of money on the labour to take the secondary air system out, and obviously a lot of labour to renew it and refit it. So on understanding that this can be fixed with a laptop for relatively little money in comparison to the repair for the new part and labour, that is obviously the way to go, especially for a sports car. So with secondary air, you talk about secondary air systems to a lot of people, and I've got absolutely no idea what it does, how it runs. So if a workshop has got the car idling and it's warm, and they're saying that they can hear an air leak, it must be the secondary air system. Well, this secondary air pump was only ever working 20 seconds after cold start, so how can it be exhibiting a leak when the car is fully warm? It's just complete nonsense. Anyway, best fix for the car is to take the secondary air system out of the valley, file that in the very satisfying place, which is the bin, and then reprogram the car's electronics. Right, so that's secondary air injection dealt with. Let's go and deal with EGR. Right, so it is only the V8 engine that needs secondary air injection and EGR, and here we can see why. So we can see the 4-cylinder V8 manifold there with no primary catalyst, and then it has a secondary catalyst. So that secondary cat is quite far downstream. So what that needed was secondary air injection to get that catalyst working hotter sooner. Now we have a look at the V12 manifold, and you can see that that primary catalyst is already so close to the exhaust port, meaning that it got hot very quick without the bolt-on technology, if you can call it that, of secondary air injection. So the V12 engine does not need secondary air injection. Now, if we look at the V8 system, it needs exhaust gas recirculation. Now, the V12 engine has exhaust gas recirculation, but if you've watched my other videos, we call that internal exhaust gas recirculation. That's because someone set a huge valve overlap on the inlet and exhaust cam, which meant the exhaust gases coming out of the primary pipe, a very small amount gets sucked back up into the combustion chamber because of that valve overlap. Now, this was set on purpose so that about 5% of air charge is spent gas. Now, what that does is reduce nitrous oxide emissions. So the V8 has external EGR. So instead of the valve overlap being responsible for drawing back up into the combustion chamber the spent gas, we've now got this outlet pipe on the exhaust manifold that connects to an external pipe, and that external pipe connects to the EGR valve, which goes into the inlet manifold. So that is the two different approaches to exhaust gas recirculation. Now, both approaches achieve the same end result, which is a small percentage of spent gas mixed into fresh air charge for the purpose of reducing nitrous oxide emissions. It's just that the V8 was done sort of properly, but that meant a pipe, a valve, and a software strategy to monitor it. And a V12 was done on a bit of a wing and a prayer. We say wing and a prayer because, as we know, years down the line, that suck back of gas, if the catalyst fails, causes catalyst debris to be sucked back up with the spent gas into the chamber. Okay, so we look at the V8 system. We've got our little stub pipe there, we've got the pipe, we've got the valve, and that goes into the inlet manifold. Now, what any percentage of exhaust gas recirculation does is just make drivability, on-throttle responsiveness very lethargic. So really, we don't want it on a sports car at all. Now, it's this valve that can sometimes fail, causes the emissions light to come on the dashboard, and at some garages, they tell you you need a new valve. Best thing to do, file that in the place that we filed it earlier, and then put a blanking plate on here, and then fix the car with the laptop. So, are you starting to see the difference of an approach to looking after cars from a garage that is fundamentally run by petrol heads for petrol heads? Problems that can be easily fixed with a laptop, generating no meaningful repair bill, is a way to fix the catalyst, the EGR, the secondary air, and the tracker system. Now, at a main agent, those fixes would have to get fixed in a factory way. They follow procedure, factory write the procedure. If your primary catalyst is failed, you fit a new exhaust manifold. That is the procedure. If your EGR valve is failed, you pick a new EGR valve off the shelf, you fit the EGR valve. So the dealer network is just following factory process, and there's no problem with that. But what we're identifying is a bit of a cleverer way to look after these cars. Now, for instance, where I've just mentioned a cost save fix like that, for some reason on some forums I get quite a bit of stick about banging on about primary cap failure on the V12s. Now, if you think about this, a garage would be better off to keep stum about that, because it would make more revenue fixing engines than it would do doing primary decats. So advising that a primary decat is done is the advice of a petrol head for petrol heads, because it's the least evil to a problem that could catastrophically fail an engine. You know, as these cars age, you've got several things happening here. You've got years of deferred maintenance from previous owners that knew they weren't going to keep the car for a very long time, so didn't preventative maintenance fix issues. That's why these cars can store up quite a bit of deferred maintenance. You've then got 10 or 15-year-old cars, and it don't matter what make they are, they suffer 10 or 15-year-old car problems, sorts of things that go wrong after many years of use. Misfire, wiring harnesses, breakage in wheel bearings, or whatever component it is that you want to name. There's certain component failures that happen after a certain time that will happen on many cars. And then you've got some problems. We won't call them manufacturing defects, because there's no such thing as a manufacturing defect. Let's just call them curiously repeatable. You've got these curiously repeatable problems like the LED strip in the headlamp, rear lamps filling up with water, paint blistering. Add all of that lot together, the perfect storm of curiously repeatable problems, deferred maintenance, 10-year-old car problems, and all that means, because we want the joy and theatre and everything goes with ownership, that ownership experience now needs to be looked after in a workshop which is run by petrol heads for petrol heads. If your secondary air injection system fails on a 20-year-old car and you've got a £3,000 repair bill being quoted for it, then you really should question if the garage quoting you that repair bill is approaching it with a petrol head mentality. But that's what I think of it. What do you think of it? Give us your comments in the section below. Click us a like, subscribe to Bamfordrose channel. Check us out on all social media platforms, because what we try and do now is mix it up a bit and divide out what content we put on different platforms. So check us out everywhere. Hey, if you were the dealer technician watching and you haven't clicked the Patreon button, then click it. I've just taught you how to do your job.